welcome everyone to our inaugural BSidesSF Human Behavioral Panel, Switched On, Behavioral Science, Hypervigilance, and the Human Impact of Cyber Defense and Crisis Management. In the age of COVID, the impacts from prolonged stress, information overload, and the perception of increased consequences to life have exploded into public consciousness in the form of brain fog, pandemic fatigue, sleep deprivation, and a laundry list of other physical and mental symptoms. None of these effects are new to first responders, security, and medical personnel whose daily lives are focused on identifying, protecting from, and responding to the threats. We pride ourselves, as a matter of fact, on being switched on, ever vigilant and ready for the next attack. This hypervigilance is unsustainable, however, and in reality, counterproductive. Today's panel is going to approach this as a human performance problem, viewed through three different and interdependent lenses: individual, the team, and the leader. We hope to introduce some concepts to you to help optimize your individual, team, and functional outcomes. Now I'd like to introduce our panel. We're going to start with Jeanine Stewart. Jeanine is a neuroscientist and former tenured professor who has spent her career helping military teams, brain surgeons, rocket scientists, and mere mortals to be better, more inclusive leaders. She is currently a leadership and culture strategist at the Neuroleadership Institute. Next is Bob Lord. Bob is a battle-tested cybersecurity leader. He has practiced his art at some of the biggest technology companies in the world, including Netscape, AOL Time Warner, Twitter, and Yahoo. He is currently the Chief Security Officer for the Democratic National Committee. And last but certainly not least, Susan Owen-Langley. Susan is a licensed clinical social worker who has spent her career helping individuals, leaders, and Fortune 500 companies develop strategies to strengthen emotional well-being, improve productivity, and successfully manage critical incidents. She's the founder of Comprehensive Employee Services, which is a crisis management and EAP consultancy. Please welcome everyone on the panel. Very much looking forward to our conversation. Now, Bob, I want to turn to you and ask you to set the stage by describing a personal story of a cybersecurity incident. Can you describe the scene?
Yeah, so let me give Susan and Jeanine a little bit of background to kind of set the stage. So, as a security leader, my life is very busy. It is really busy. And so my days often begin very early, sometimes between 4:30 and 5 a.m. And sometimes, if it's a good day, I can sleep in until 5 a.m. So that's not a lot of sleep, but the job's super interesting and I learn a lot from the team. So that's great. I usually have meetings that can go until 5 or 6 p.m. and then I can really start my actual work day. And so there's a lot of context switching and there's not a lot of time for deep work. And I think it's a pretty common experience that there's a lot of ongoing stress as we're trying to get initiatives put through. And they often receive a fair amount of resistance. And so, what I tell people is that we in the security profession, we're in this really awkward position of having to care more about the data that we're trying to protect than the data owners. And so, we spend often a lot of time fighting internal processes or teams and tech debt to try to prevent an incident, and we're often short of budget or security talent. We can't cross-train enough. We often find that we can't take a real vacation and that we cheat on vacations and try to do a little work. And when we don't cheat, we're trying to be good. Somebody inevitably calls. So it's a hell of a career choice if you think about it. And so talking about a scenario. There's a pretty common scenario that comes up where, let's say that a reporter gives me a call and she claims to have some data that some hacker found on the dark web or something like that. And so, that might be true, but it's more likely that the data has been circulating for, years. And that's one of these data dumps that we've seen from time to time. And so best case is I have to spend time convincing the reporter that what she's found is not actually interesting, and then I can get back to business. But in this case, let's say that there's something about the snippet of data that she's provided, and it doesn't really match any of the previous false alarms that we've run into on a regular basis. And it's increasingly looking like our systems may have been penetrated at some point. So at this point, things kind of get real interesting. And, if something like that were to happen, we'd have to activate the incident response plan. We'd have to start calling executives, the general counsel, maybe the communications teams, maybe outside counsel. We've got to figure out how to pull people in from the security teams, but also other teams to take a look at the data. We may have to create war rooms. And, we may have to decide, do we call the FBI? Who calls the FBI? And do we call now, or do we call when we have more data? And who owns that relationship? Spoiler alert, everybody, it's going to be the lawyers who are probably going to own the conversation with the FBI, and that'll add its own set of stress. So, and during these times, I'll just share that on the one hand, we're the people who want to run towards the flames, and this is why we're here. And on the other hand, it is slow and it is messy. Time dilation is real. You lose track of time very, very quickly. And we're constantly wondering if we've got the right team on the right set of problems. And the fog of war is really real. Executives are asking for hourly updates when we know it may take many hours or maybe days to get the kind of information that they're looking for. So, let me just kind of pause there, because this is sort of the way many of these events unfold. They kind of ramp up. And from that point on, you're in full incident response mode. And the thing that went from, the thing is that we've gone from a world where we've have this low grade constant stress to now full on war, so to speak. So let me just kind of pause there and see where people want to take this.
Well, I'll jump
Bob.
in.
Go ahead, Jeanine.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll jump right in. What's coming to mind immediately from a neuroscience perspective is our brains are not wired to do anything you've described. And of course, we know that. That's why we're here. The way our brains are wired in terms of taking in information and assessing how stressful or how stressed out we ought to be really boils down to our system, our neural system being fine-tuned to take in information from a variety of sources. In the neural sense, that would mean some sensory input, some cognitive input, some social input from our interactions with other human beings, like the reporter's call. And we sort all of that, each bit of input, each bit of information at a neural level moves us in one of two directions. And what we're monitoring and netting out at every given moment is, am I moving toward a place of higher threat or risk? i.e., am I at risk of ceasing to exist as a human being? So our brains are really fine-tuned to say, am I safe enough to keep living? Or do I need to intervene in some way in order to maximize the other side of the equation, which I'll call the reward side? So we kind of have a spectrum that we're tracking neurally, below the level of consciousness, by the way. And it at one end is maximum threat, risk, maybe death. At the other end is maximum reward. I think of that as blissed out on the beach with a Mai Tai. So our brain is constantly saying, where am I? And what we're going for ideally is an adaptive middle zone. And in fact, what our brains want to do is to be able to flex a bit in that middle zone, to be able to say, all right, something threatening's happening. It's okay, because I'm going to bring myself back to that reward side of the equation. Not too far, though. I want to stay engaged in the work. And a couple of things you mentioned, Bob, come to mind in terms of that adaptive engagement and that flow between threat and reward. You mentioned that the work is really interesting and it's kind of exciting. And the challenges seem to engage you. So that's all signs of the adaptive zone. However, when you extend too far toward the threat side of the equation, that's where our bodies can start to say, uh-oh, I'm not going to be able to come back. And the net result of that over time can be significant unrelenting stress and stress-related illness. And so there's a cost to that hypervigilance, that hovering at the threat end of the spectrum too much or too long.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeanine.
You know, that balance that you're talking about, I call it, in terms of stress, not all stress is bad. I call it the zone of best performance. That zone where you're energized, you're motivated, you're meeting demands. And as Bob said, you know, I really like this work. And so the level, the zone of best performance for many in cybersecurity is probably more than maybe the average person not in cybersecurity. But I think, Jeanine, that's what you're talking about. Figure out what your zone is, and when it starts tipping and the stress is upping, the threat is creating more and more stress, you're going to get signs you're on overload. And that's some of what I'll talk about. But I like to call it, you know, the zone of best performance, that level of stress that really works, helps us work well in all parts of our life. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Because the media tends to say all stress is bad, and it's really not true. It's our brain trying to figure out what's the best zone that I want to try and stay in, and try and figure out how to do that.
Susan, how can you give some examples of how you can optimize, what some tools are that you can try to stay in that zone while not burning out?
Well, do you want me to go through all my? Well, stress is, you know, what Jeanine's saying is it's our body's response to a demand that we're not sure we don't know if we have the ability to meet it or not. So it sets off that alarm. If we meet it, the alarm goes off. If we don't, and there's just Bob's point, if we have constant demands, we have no time to just take a step back, that alarm is on nonstop, to your point, and your brain is hyperactivated to, oh my God, worst case scenario. So to notice the signs, if that's your point, is exhaustion, sleep disability, you know, deprivation, irritability. You know, it's going to impact your performance, losing focus. So what people can do, I mean, I got a list of things that we can go into in detail to how, because you're wanting to know how do you counteract that when you notice it. Is that what you're asking, Will?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, Jeanine.
Before we go down that road, I think something you said there was really interesting, and I bring it back to Bob for a second. You know, she kind of talked about indicators and warnings, which is something that we look at functionally in our jobs, but we don't necessarily think about as individuals. Can you talk about some examples of in the scenario you gave of where you've seen signs in yourself or in others of that stress starting to set in?
Yeah, and I sort of I really appreciate this part of the conversation, because as you were talking about these different modes, I recall that somebody once said to me during an incident, somebody whispered to me, "You secretly love this, don't you?" And I said, "No, I don't. I do not love being in this situation, but this is what we've been trained for. This is what we've been trying to prevent. But now that we're here, we have a game plan, and we're going to do our best." So there's that part of it. But then other times when that sort of stress lasts for an extended period of time, for days, weeks, months, it's, you know, you can't be in that hypervigilant state the entire time, and yet we sort of have to. And so I sort of appreciate that part of the dialogue. For me personally, you know, I can notice when we're going from the excitement of the chase to the to feeling like we have so much that we have to accomplish in a short amount of time, and there are so many different expectations, and that lasts for an extended period of time. Like, I can feel that in my body. I can feel that in different parts of my body, my shoulders or my back, and I can physically feel that. It's almost like there's a weight that is on me. And so, you know, personally, I've tried to find ways to notice those kinds of signals as early as I can, and then to try to do something about it, whether it's take walks or exercise more or something like that. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about, you know, once I notice those triggers, what is it that I should be doing to respond to those?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I recommend, and it was in an article I read from the Harvard Business Review, manage your time, not your energy, is just take note and take a break, literally. And it can be in 5, 10, 15 minutes where you just disengage from work and do something that has nothing to do with work for 5, 10, 15 minutes. That can mean take a walk. It can mean listen to music. It can mean, eat a healthy snack. Because lots of times when we're immersed in this, we're not eating, we're overstressed. So that's, you take regular breaks throughout the day. And Jeanine probably can confirm that. Basically, about anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes, our body's going to tell us it's time to take a break. You're feeling it in your body. Some people are going to feel it. They start yawning. They're hungry. They're restless. And all of a sudden, it's called presenteeism. They're there looking at the computer, but nothing's going in. So when you notice that, after a couple of hours, just 5, 10 minutes, just walk away, and you will find it's a little bit of a reboot to go back and be focused. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So okay. So the thing that I should be noticing is when either myself or other members of the team, and this will be harder to do in a socially distant COVID world, but I guess for ourselves, notice, and I really like that trigger, which is I'm staring at the same screen and I'm not doing anything. And
presenteeism, the new term. It's spell check always tells me I'm wrong, but I know I'm not.
So yeah, I guess I can notice that in myself, and if we were in the physical offices, I could notice that in other people to some degree, but we're not with other people right now. How do we deal with that?
Well, people, what you might notice as a leader, for example, is somebody you've scheduled a meeting and they're not showing up at the meeting at all, or again, they're there, but they're not there. In other words, they're not interacting, they're not engaging in any way. And usually if you have a meeting, everybody has an opportunity to say something, to engage. So that would be one way to notice doing it virtually. Or somebody missing a deadline. That's pretty big, and virtually you're going to know that if they miss a deadline. That's bigger, but not showing up, or if they're at a meeting, not engaging, that would be a beginning sign. No, since everything's virtual, mostly everything is.
Jeanine, proactively, can you talk about, from a leadership perspective, proactively, how can we kind of prepare for these kind of things ahead of time, as opposed to, when we're seeing these signs in our teams?
One of the things that's coming to mind, just based on what Susan is sharing, is that proactively leaders and teams can develop a shared language for checking in and evaluating where we are on the threat spectrum. We can keep it simple, and in fact, we often, my colleagues and I at the Neuroleadership Institute, we often refer to this in terms of a 3-level system. So think about what level of threat you're experiencing as. A level 1 is I'm alert, I'm engaged. It may feel intense, but I'm able to focus. A level 2 is I can't maintain focus for very long. I notice that I've got maybe 20 or 30 minutes of capacity, and then I'm distracted or distractible. And so I feel myself swinging in and out of that adaptive zone we were describing earlier. A level 3 threat is I'm really not able to hold my focus. I'm not able to dig in and do my best work. And so if a group has that shared language, which is taking that proactive step of saying, this is how we're going to check in with one another, and then we develop the routine of checking in with one another. Maybe it's twice a day during crises, or more often than that, whatever's appropriate for the work. It gives you a quick way of saying, all right, who needs support? And demonstrating that support for one another is really critically important, especially when we're working through the level of challenge and mental exertion that you're describing, Bob. It's just critically important to know we're not in it alone, even if we're sitting in our own cubicle in our own home-based office.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, I'm intrigued by this idea, but I wonder is it not the case that people will feel compelled to say that they're ones or twos when they're really threes? Like how would I get the team members to really be honest, knowing if everybody says one and I'm a three, do I really say that I'm a three? How do you help people understand that's okay to be the only three in a group of ones?
I think that's a great question, and actually something that I've seen change across industries. I work with, in my consulting role, I work with people across the wide spectrum of industries. One thing that we've noticed over the past year is that people can't leave it at the door anymore. And so it's partly a leadership challenge for us to acknowledge as leaders that whatever signals we're sending about what is expected moment to moment or throughout a crisis or a normal workday, we probably need to modify some of those signals and do that in a proactive way. So even when we're not dealing with a crisis, what signals are you sending to your team that you understand that not everybody is equally resilient today? Not everybody is going to feel the same degree of readiness for the full workload, even in the day-to-day. Maybe I have a family member who's ill. Maybe I'm feeling the strain of financial pressures within my family. So sending those signals and engaging those issues on an ongoing basis gives us a readiness to extend the grace and courtesy when things get tougher, when the heat increases. Does that make sense? Does that help at all, Bob?
I think also as a leader, if you meet I put a stress management leader to check in regularly with your employees, which could be one-on-one, but it can also be in a meeting where you say, you know what, we're in a high stress atmosphere, workplace, hyper-vigilant, and we all have a different level of how we manage it. And I want to hear if you have you're sensing a potential problem in the workplace. I want to hear about potential solutions. And, I want to hear it really doesn't have to be, to your point, Jean, I'm fine. Because people will say I'm fine, because if they don't, then maybe you, Bob, the leader, is going to feel like they're really not up to the job. Which is, so as a leader, I would say you go beyond it. You can really say, it's okay if you're not fine. I'm here to listen and to share. Let's, as a group, to your point, some of us are having a good day and we're right on focus, and some of us, the stress from home, right here with me, and so I'm not as focused. But we can be open about that because we can help each other, support each other, and also solve problems that are occurring for the team. Does that make sense, Bob? And Jeanine, that sort of pulls that together. If you're regular, I like the check-in, a regular check-in. Then, if a manager like Bob calls a meeting, it's like, not, oh my God, it's okay, well, this is our platform to share what's working and what's not.
Yeah, I think building up the habit of doing that in peacetime. So we talk about things left of boom and right of boom. So and I think a lot of the stress that we have is that we're left of boom, but we know there's going to be a boom, and we know that we can't we can't prevent all booms. And so, right of boom, you're going to have to rely on your training or your incident response plan or other cultural norms. And so I like the idea of doing that in peacetime, left of boom, so that it becomes okay when you're right of boom to be much more honest, because I think the health of the overall team depends on understanding where everybody is at that particular point. I think that's worth considering. I don't know if anybody's watching. We can talk about this in Reddit, but if anybody's actually done that successfully before, I'd love to hear more about that particular practice. You might even, I'm just sort of spitballing here, but it might be the sort of thing that you weave into incident response plan as a thing that you do as a normal thing, and you put it in there, and it's just what we do when we hold, and these meetings they're ad hoc, and they're emergencies. Like the CISO is calling a meeting in 5 minutes and everybody has to stop what they're doing, and they're all researching. If you're right of boom, they're all researching, they're all doing something, but we now have either new news, and so we have to trade information back and forth between teams or whatever, and maybe making that as part of the standing meeting agenda, which is go around the room and ask everybody for their particular status. That could be pretty interesting. So that's I'd love to hear more about other people who've tried something like that.
Well, I can tell you in terms of a critical incident, Will would know this because I've been called in to do critical incident and have the leader say, look, to employees, an EAP professional is going to be available to talk one-on-one, but also in a group. And in that group setting, Bob, I'm able to say, here's what normally people experience when there's been an incident, when there's been a traumatic event, normally experience of grief and loss. Here's what's normal. And there's no time limit on that. But this group is an opportunity I use it as an opportunity if it's an employee, for example, who's been injured or died, to share about that and begin to share, their thoughts and feelings around grief and loss. Because also many have had grief and loss and trauma in the past, which comes up. What happens organically in those groups that I've run is that there's peer-to-peer support that already starts in that group. Oh, you felt that way too? Or, we had, when there was a suicide, we had an employee say, I talked to him. I really, we all tried to check in, but it really created a really good support peer-to-peer that occurred in the group. And guess what? After the fact, it continued. Because I was still on site and they're talking to each other, because now that we were all in that group together, we all know we have these same kind of feelings. It's okay to say, hey, Bob, that group was really helpful. This is really hard, or, that helped me get through today and go beyond. So that it is the group dynamic, especially after crisis, it really helps employees manage the stress and the grief and loss, and also see their coworkers as resources for support.
I'd echo that, the power of labeling and just pausing to say, this is my experience. It doesn't have to take long or detract from the urgent work to just take 30 seconds to say, I'm here. I am at this level, or I am experiencing the following emotions or reactions. And in fact, those micro opportunities to insert reflection, human connection, and even just to use the process of labeling itself shifts us from a chaotic emotional experience to a more controlled, rational, analytical experience, if you will, in the brain. That shift actually is a way of backing away from the precipice, just at a micro level. But realize that the burnout, the depletion of this intense work, this hyper-vigilant experience followed by boom or crisis, that's an incremental process of depletion as well. It's okay to think in terms of incremental steps that we can take to restore. We can't wait for the vacation that never comes.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that, to your point, the labeling, a lot of people go through shock and numbness and label, and they go through anger. And here's what anger can look like. And lots of times under the anger is the fear we have for our own mortality. But to your point, labeling that, because a lot of people feel like, I must be crazy because I'm having these thoughts and feelings about what's happening. And so you're right, labeling it and normalizing it. Oh, you mean other people really feel this way? Okay, I feel a little better. And then what I've done after a crisis, sometimes also I've offered one-on-one, and I told Will about an experience. The employees were spread all over. They were working on Optum lines, whatever, for optical lines, I don't know, for a tech company. But the manager walked me around the floor. It was early in the morning, 7:30, saying, Susan Owen-Langley's here. She's available if you want to talk. And interestingly enough, several people came to my office. The employees were mostly men, five or six men, one woman, individually. And as we talked, they were like, oh my God, I had no idea. It was, wow, this is what I'm feeling. And it triggered like a loss of a parent or loss of whatever. And they said, wow, thank you so much. I had no idea because I put the pieces of the puzzle together for them in a way, because they've never sought counseling. Lots of people, and maybe some in the audience is like, I don't need it. I'm not weak. I can do this myself, are like, this was really, and I got several emails at post of that saying, I don't know that I could have done it without having that option. So you're right. That was the follow-up, that because of the depletion, and they were like, how do I do this? So that was how we did it. And it was very helpful for those people, because none of them had ever had counseling before, ever.
Yeah, Susan, I think that's a great point. And Bob, I want to kind of throw it over to you, because I know in our world, that kind of, we're supposed to be the specialists in crisis management. I mean, that's on people's resumes. So it's easy to do it for somebody else. How do you do it for yourself and for your team?
So, so since you started talking about this panel, I've been thinking a little bit about this, and as I was trying to write down some of the things that I thought I had done either well or maybe not so well as an individual, you'll laugh a little bit at this, but I started to think like, oh, so I have to like identify various things that are going on, like what are my goals, and I have to find ways to protect myself. And then if I can't protect myself because there's going to be a security incident of some sort, I have to detect that, and then I have to respond, and I have to recover. And I was thinking, wait a minute, where have I heard all of that before? And so I started really trying to break down the things that I needed to do as an individual to against that, what basically is the 5 continuous defender activities from the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so I started writing things down, and I was like, oh, so what am I doing with my daily habits? What am I doing to protect myself up front around sleep? And by the way, nobody's told me I don't get enough sleep on this panel, so I'm sure you're going to go there at some point.
I got it.
Okay. I'm sure. I love being like psychoanalyzed in public. It's great. So like sleep, managing your diet, and thinking about one of the things that I'm sure we'll bring up later, which is alcohol consumption in this profession, and then things to do to detect those stressors. So I was, like I said, I was looking back at how I personally respond to different kinds of stress, and on the one hand, there are parts of this that I really like. I like that stress, and then there are other times when it becomes prolonged. And so then how do I respond to that with either breathing? Sometimes I go for a walk, or I try to get sleep, but frankly, in the middle of an incident, that's very difficult. And then how have I recovered? How have I learned from those incidents to go back and improve my overall program? And so I don't know if that's a useful model for other people. And I think like a lot of metaphors, you can't stretch it too far. But I started to kind of break things down into that for my personal experience. And I think for teams, it's also similar to that. Teams can learn how to understand what happens left of boom versus right of boom, and they can do things up front to inoculate themselves a little bit, so they can think about what they can do today that will cause fewer problems later down the line. One of the things I tell people who may not have had all of my experiences is when you're writing things down in texts, in emails, in presentations, is to focus on facts and the future. And that's because you're left of boom now, and you don't understand how people right of boom are going to either misconstrue or misunderstand the things that you wrote. So if you write things down like, we should have upgraded the server by now, that seems like a fact, but it's actually more of an opinion or an assessment. And if you compare that to a phrase like, Allison upgraded server 19 from version X to version Y on December 2nd, that's much closer to a fact. And again, right of boom, people will have a very different set of incentives. And so obviously, like, lawyers or investigators. And so, this is just sort of a really small example, But the more people can focus on things like writing down facts and thinking about the future, as opposed to assessing the past, I think that framing can really help inoculate the team later down the line when a new group of people come in to second guess all of their work. And that second guessing can last for years. So it can be pretty painful.
Yeah, I think about reframing your thinking. Reframe your thinking from, because our brain, Jeanine would know, goes to worst case scenario when there's a potential, like, oh, it's going to happen. We automatically go to worst case, oh my God, it's worst case scenario. Instead of reframe your thinking, to your point, Bob, what are the facts? What do I know to be true that I can then begin to decide what are my options for dealing with right of boom or whatever's going to happen. But it's reframing it. Okay, it's a problem to be solved. I've got experience. I'm going to fact check, and I'll look at how I've been successful in the past. Can I use that now? That reframing, and Jeanine, I think that resets the brain a bit to get it closer to that zone of that I can still perform.
Yeah, the two things I would underscore, well said, Susan, I would just underscore that future orientation and a sort of acknowledging that the state of the reader in the future may be different, gives you some opportunity to take control of something that is otherwise vastly uncertain, the future. Right. So getting clear on, what is your intended use of this record, this comment, this communication, is actually a really helpful. We call it a certainty reward. Humans are we are undone by uncertainty, and an unknown. An uncertainty is actually worse than a known bad. Like if we can know what's coming, even if it's not something we would desire, we feel better than not knowing at all. So just converting, that's like a little mental trick that actually can buy a little bit of energy back, a little bit of restoration. Just being able to take that mindset of picturing the future user, the future scenario where someone's going to rely on the communication we're generating or the record we're generating, I think is a very wise technique.
That's an interesting.
Yeah, no, that definitely.
Sorry, Susan, but Bob, I think this ties in. I've heard a lot of things about, consequence management from Susan and what Jeanine just said kind of reminded me of the after actions that we always do. And they're usually very technical. Have you ever seen one that, talks about the performance behaviors of the actual emotional and human behavioral aspects of this and the leadership behaviors in an after action?
I don't know that I've seen it to the degree that I think you're hinting we probably should think about it. One of the things that I do encourage people to do is to read up on various breaches and responses. And one of the challenges that we'll be familiar with, but I don't know if Jeanine and Susan are fully familiar with this, but it is often the case that we don't have a ton of public information about various breaches. And so one of the things that organizations want to do is figure out how to learn to improve just the basic operations of their security programs. And so you might think you can just go read a book about it, and it turns out that that's not as easy as you would think. And so there are a few places where the information is documented. So, for example, and I can talk about this a little bit in the Reddit, but the Yahoo breach is interesting in that it was documented in a Department of Justice indictment of four foreign nationals, and it goes into great detail about exactly what they did. And then there's also a 10K report that the board produced, which has some interesting information. And so I've gone to various groups and I've spoken about how to take a look at these and other breaches to inform what we're doing. And it's not a skill that I think that is really common in our industry because there is so little information truly available. I should also give a shout out to Neil Deswani, who's writing a book on breaches, which I think will actually help solve a small part of this problem. But we don't have an NSTB for for cyber incidents. And so we don't have that kind of structure. And I think, Will, you're talking about yet another layer, which is even deeper than just understanding the breach itself and what the root causes were, but how the teams responded at an emotional and human level. I think that's some next generation stuff that you're proposing, and I think it's probably a good one. But I don't know that I've heard of anybody actually going as far as I think you would like us to go. So maybe somebody in Reddit will tell us. They've done it.
Would that be going with your teams? Like, well, to your point, what did we learn? What did we do that worked, but what did we learn that we can use and go forward? Does that make sense? Because that's what the effort would be.
I think there is a lot of that, Susan. I think there is a lot of that, but it's very technical. It may talk about the process and the timeline and the technical, but the piece that's missing is how did we perform as a team, as individuals, et cetera. Jeanine, have you, since you've been, widely looked at done a lot of research on this and looked at different industrial sectors, have you seen groups that do this well?
What's coming to mind for me is probably a modification of a 360 review for leaders that many executive coaches work with teams to do that. And so for a team to do an after action review that really gets at the behaviors that and choices that were made, the decision-making processes from a behavioral or interactive standpoint, that's the kind of approach that's coming to mind for me. That might be useful.
Yeah, and I think, Bob, that talks to your point earlier about kind of that transparency from the get-go, creating that environment and that culture ahead of time, not after the fact. So when you do have something like that, it's actually, people feel free to talk honestly and give good feedback so they can, and be supportive of everybody else on the team.
There are additional benefits to that vulnerability on the part of the leader or the leadership team as well, to show even if they do it relative to some smaller events, more minor events, that vulnerability and getting practiced at saying, I could have done better here, or we as a group could have anchored on the facts and gotten out of our emotional space a little bit better. That vulnerability builds the trust that feeds back on that question we were talking about earlier of someone just being willing to say, my head is not in the game today, I'm at a level 3 threat. It just, that comes from the practice over time of saying, we could have done better, how can we get better?
Well, and that's a practice of a leader saying, I know, and you're not necessarily, I know a lot, but I don't know everything, so I depend on the various expertise of my team members, because every team member has a different gift that they probably bring to the job. And so that's that vulnerability. I know a lot, but I don't know everything, and I'm open to saying that. I'm open to learning, and that's why this team we can work together to find the answers, pre-response, post-response. The other little tidbit in terms of the emotional behavioral piece after the fact is, and in general as leaders, is to express appreciation and recognition for what everybody did to get through the crisis now that they're on the other side. An employee said to me long ago in an incident, appreciation, recognition for a job well done to the best of our ability is high octane for the soul. It's just a great motivator. So that can be a post-response, but ongoing, as people are, smaller things doing well, whether it's a note of thanks, whether it's a call, but in a meeting, post-response, it's another thing to do.
Susan, I love that, because as Bob can attest, in our world, in the security world, it's very much, break glass in case of fire. So there's not a lot, nobody's necessarily, they know we're there, they expect us to respond. We respond, people go through everything that we've just talked about. And then afterwards, it's just like, okay, well, that was your job. now we put you back in the glass until the next time around. And I think that whole idea of gratitude.
That's what you need to do now.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I had an employee who I worked with, and she was responsible to, CEO, whatever. And it was constant. I don't know if she was in communication, whatever. Constant. She did, working on this project, working, put her whole team together. They finished the project. They present it to the CEO. He goes, "Great, good job. Now, can you get going on this?" She said, "We had no time to breathe and not an ounce of just appreciation or recognition for the amount of time and effort everybody put into it." And she said, to your point, Jeanine, she was completely depleted. But that's where that just recognition of what you did as a job. Thank you. I appreciate it. You made a good, we value your contribution. So that's a true example, actually.
Jeanine or Bob, have either of you seen examples of where that's done really well, like that could be the benchmark?
Jeanine, you want to take that?
So in terms of doing this well, yes, I have actually. I have seen people do this very well and actually work very diligently to improve their practices, because it does not come naturally to any of us. Someone mentioned earlier, our brains go negative very readily.
I did evolution. Yep.
Yeah, and we will stay there, right? We will, and Bob, you mentioned you lean on your training. Well, some of your training is to look for the novel event that is different and potentially negative. And so part of the system is designed to actually affirm our tendency to deplete ourselves. So I think as we're kind of bringing this toward a close, one of the things that's really coming up for me is the notion of depletion, and the issue, Bob, you mentioned earlier, alcohol use, for example, or other self-medicating strategies that are some of our go-tos when we don't have a whole system that is helping us to restore on a regular basis. We will default to some readily available strategies that aren't as positive. And so bringing awareness to that risk of depletion, and the fact that we can't afford to deplete these people. We can't afford to deplete Bob and team and all participants on the line today. We need to be more proactive and intentional in order to break some of those habits and protect ourselves and our most powerful assets in cyber defense.
Thank you, Jeanine.
Well,
I think
and what
that's
you were talking about, Bob.
Sorry, hold on one second, Susan. Sorry about that. I love that, Jeanine. Thank you very much. I think that's a great segue. We're coming up on just a couple more minutes. So I want to go and just ask everybody what their one thing is, what the big takeaway is. If the audience can only remember one thing, what would that be? And Susan, I'll go straight to you.
My one big thing is be aware of the gap that many of us have between our head and our heart. What our head knows we should be doing, to your point, to manage stress more effectively, eat healthy, get sleep, versus our core going, yeah, but I don't have time. I'm okay when they're really not. Which takes me to the big thing is it's a sign of courage and inner strength to ask for professional help. I need guidance to help me not get so depleted and to restore me. And it's a sign of strength when you're open to asking for help from a professional. And the long term is you then have more skills and strategies for when, to your point, Jeanine, when things happen in the future.
And Jeanine, back to you. Anything?
Make sense?
Yeah, so I'm thinking my big takeaway would be we slide on this spectrum from extreme threat to extreme reward. It's especially important that we cultivate the habits of checking in, not only with ourselves and labeling where we are, but also with others on our teams, and finding the common language, building the common language to check in and acknowledge that when we are getting depleted, we need to take micro steps to restore and not wait until it is too late.
That's great. Bob, final thought?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I appreciate about Will, you pulling this panel together is helping me think through the things that we talked about here. We talked about sleep, we talked about alcohol moderation and eating right. We talked about all of those different elements, but I continue to wonder. I'm speculating that a lot of the same skills that we use to plan for and respond to and recover from security incidents, if those aren't some of the same processes that we should use for ourselves and our teams. So that for me is the takeaway. I don't know if I have the takeaway for the rest of the audience, but for me, I'm actually going to start writing some of these things down and trying to partition them so I understand where I'm going to be spending some of my energies and how I can actually prepare left of boom for all the things that happen right of boom to myself and to the team. So thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all. There are so many important things I think that were said here. I really appreciate everybody's time, and just want to take this last minute to thank everyone in the audience for joining. Thank Netflix for sponsoring this panel, and especially to you, the panelists, for all the time you put into preparing for this and for just the really important thoughts that you've shared with us on this important topic. For those of you who have questions for the panelists or want to share your thoughts and join the conversation, please join us on the Switched On subreddit immediately after this. And also, please give us your feedback on whether you'd like to further explore human behavior at future B-Sides. Other than that, everyone, thank you again and enjoy the con.